The best justice money can buy. Donald Trump pursues legal challenges others can't afford. The promise of the U.S. judicial system may be equal justice for all, but former President Donald Trump's flurry of motions and appeals in his criminal and civil cases has shown how much deep pockets can tip the scales. Nearly all criminal defendants plead guilty rather than fight charges at trial. But Trump's fundraising of tens of millions of dollars has paid lawyers to argue all the way to the Supreme Court that charges in his federal election interference case should be dismissed. Everyone is intended to be afforded equal justice. However, the reality is you receive as much justice as you can afford, said Tim Parlator, a lawyer who represented Trump during the early phases of the classified documents and election interference investigations. Trump has been indicted on 88 felony counts in 4 separate cases. He was convicted of 34 counts of falsifying business records in New York. A federal judge in Florida dismissed 40 charges related to hoarding classified documents after leaving the White House, thanks to Trump's deep pockets funding motions making novel arguments. Those could be reinstated by a higher court, but the process will be lengthy and the outcome uncertain. Trials are pending on accusations of election interference with 4 federal counts in Washington and 10 state counts in Georgia, but the Supreme Court ordered a review that could throw out charges in those cases and possibly vacate his convictions. The bottom line, despite many of his efforts failing, Trump's legal battles have delayed his remaining trials likely until after the November election. Trump's apparent limitless resources demonstrate the financial disparities that exist in our criminal justice system, said Barbara McQuaid, a former U.S. attorney who is now a law professor at the University of Michigan. A well-funded defendant has the luxury of pursuing every defense possible, even taking a flyer on obviously frivolous motions, whereas a defendant represented by a public defender or a low-cost lawyer lack that opportunity because the lawyers are overworked and underpaid. In theory, any defendant could try all of these tactics. But in reality, the costs of paying top-tier criminal defense lawyers like Trump's millions of dollars for aggressive representation would bankrupt almost any other client. Sometimes the defendant has to make that horrible choice like, I can only afford to file one motion. Which one are we going to file? Parlator said. As in politics, money doesn't guarantee victory. Trump was convicted in New York of falsifying business records to reimburse his lawyer for paying hush money to a porn actress, and he lost 2 civil trials for combined damages of more than $500 million. But even the cases he lost aren't over, as his appeals continue. Most criminal defendants plead guilty rather than force a trial. Trump's ability to pay lawyers to mount every possible legal challenge stands in stark contrast to routine criminal defendants. Nearly 90% of federal criminal defendants minus 64,139 out of 71,887 minus pleaded guilty last year, according to the Administrative Office of U.S. Courts, which tracks federal cases. About 2% of defendants minus 1,564 minus were convicted at trial. Most of the rest of the cases were dismissed, with a relative handful acquitted at trial. Many defendants, even some who are innocent, accept a plea deal to avoid the cost of mounting a criminal defense. But Trump, in addition to being a self-proclaimed billionaire, has tapped his supporters to pay his legal fees through his Save America Political Action Committee and Presidential Campaign Committee. I think the reality is simply that defendants who are well-resourced are going to have an easier time fighting against the government in court and are much more willing to risk going to trial than those who are much more limited financially, said Anthony Michael Kreis, an assistant law professor at Georgia State University. How much is Trump paying his lawyers? Trump's Save America Political Action Committee spent more than $70 million on legal consulting from Trump's leaving office in January 2021 through June 30th, according to Federal Election Committee records. The spending included $13 million to two firms of Christopher Kise, who represents Trump in his New York civil fraud lawsuit and the federal classified documents case. $8.6 million to Clifford Roberts' firm, which represents Trump in the civil fraud lawsuit. $6.7 million to Alina Habba's firm, which represented him in the fraud lawsuit and the civil defamation lawsuit brought by columnist E. Jean Carroll. $6.7 million to Todd Blanche, who represents Trump with Emil Bove in the New York hush money trial and the federal cases for classified documents and election interference. $5.4 million to John Lauro, who represents Trump in his federal election interference case. $1.5 million to Steven Sado, who represents Trump in his election racketeering case in Georgia. Fred Wertheimer, president of Democracy 21, an advocacy group for transparency in campaign funding, said if Trump is as rich as he claims, he should be paying for his own legal defense because contributing to his legal defense would be a hell of a way to buy influence with a person. While this may be all legal, it's wrong and it basically stinks, said Wertheimer, who filed an argument in the appeals court against Trump's claim of presidential immunity. Trump's campaign and several of the lawyers didn't respond to requests for comment. Legal experts said Trump's deep pockets allow him to have lawyers make arguments even with little chance of success. Mark Zotterer, a partner at Dorff, Nelson and Zotterer, who has practiced in New York for 50 years, said Trump can pitch arguments that help him politically even if they don't succeed legally. Trump's repeated efforts to have Judge Juan Merchan kicked off his New York case had no chance because his argument that Merchan had a conflict of interest because of his daughter's occupation had been examined and rejected by New York State Advisory Committee on Judicial Ethics. But it was designed to bolster his public claims of political persecution. Trump sought repeatedly to delay the trial, to prevent witnesses from testifying such as Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels, or to demand a mistrial, and to appeal his gag order. But he was rejected at nearly every turn. Trump is able to use those resources not only to launch aggressive litigation tactics, but he has demonstrated a willingness to assert things in court through his lawyers that most litigants would not, for fear of offending the court, Zotterer said. Whether or not that gets any traction in the court, it's one more opportunity to delay things and kind of throw dust. Biggest victory at Supreme Court despite claims about SEAL Team 6 assassination. Trump's biggest victory in all of his litigation was the Supreme Court ruling July 1 that former presidents can't be charged for official conduct while in office. In each of his 4 criminal cases, Trump has argued his actions were official business. But prosecutors have argued his efforts to overturn the 2020 election, to retain national defense records after he left the White House, and to pay off a porn star to silence her about an alleged affair and conceal the payments were private actions. Trump's 2 federal trials on election interference and retaining classified documents are on hold, and his sentencing in the New York hush money case was postponed as judges in each case review whether charges should be dismissed based on the ruling.